The gallery smelled faintly of beeswax, white orchids, polished wood, and money old enough to move without announcing itself. Beneath the soft wash of museum lighting, collectors moved slowly past the canvases with the careful silence of people who knew a signature could move more capital than a factory. Somewhere near the private viewing room, a fountain pen scratched across heavy paper while a senior curator murmured about provenance, tax treatment, and the discreet transfer of a post-war canvas from one family trust to another. Then Preston Langford walked in with his mistress on his arm. Brielle Sutton wore champagne silk and the smile of a woman who believed proximity to a billionaire was the same thing as power. She paused before a large abstract canvas, tilted her blonde head, and said it would look beautiful in the apartment Preston had helped arrange, loud enough for the nearest collector to hear. Preston smiled without looking at his wife, as if the insult had been framed, lit, and hung beside the art itself. Amara Delaney did not move. She stood near the far wall in a burgundy dress, pearl earrings catching a thin line of light, her hands folded around a black leather folder. Her face carried no jealousy, no panic, no public wound for the room to feed on, only the stillness of a woman who had learned that silence, when backed by ownership, could be sharper than any accusation. Preston mistook that silence for defeat. He asked the gallery associate to begin the purchase, then added that Brielle had a better eye for modern work than most wives ever develop. A few people looked down at their glasses, not because the joke was clever, but because wealth often trains people to recognize cruelty and call it taste. Amara only glanced at the painting once. The associate brought out the sale documents on thick cream paper, each page marked with discreet seals, appraisal codes, and a confidential client designation. Preston signed quickly, the nib of the pen clicking once against the table, impatient and theatrical, while Brielle watched as though the ink itself were a diamond bracelet being clasped around her wrist. He thought money had finished the conversation, but the associate did not close the folder. Instead, she turned toward Julian Graves, the gallery's senior legal director, an older man in a charcoal suit whose expression had the calm weight of locked vaults and private ledgers. Julian stepped forward, adjusted his glasses, and placed one final document on the table. "This sale requires controlling owner authorization," he said. Preston gave a small laugh, already annoyed by the delay, and reminded him that the Langford account had never been made to wait. Julian did not apologize. He simply turned the document toward Amara and addressed her with quiet precision. "Madam Chair." The room changed without a sound. Brielle's smile loosened first. Then Preston's hand lifted from the pen as if the paper had gone hot beneath his fingers. Amara opened the black folder, revealing the ownership certificate of the parent company, the final sale authorization, and the collector access clause Preston had never bothered to read. She had not come to beg for dignity. She had come to approve the transaction that proved his arrogance. Julian's voice remained even as he confirmed that Amara controlled the gallery, the private collector list, the restricted sales board, and the very approval Preston needed to give art to another woman. The collectors did not gasp. They stepped back. That was worse. Amara signed the final page, closed the folder, and looked at Preston for the first time all evening. "The sale is approved," she said, "but your access is not." For one suspended second, Preston Langford did not understand that the room had already moved on without him. His face still held the expensive arrogance of a man used to being recognized before he introduced himself, but his eyes had begun searching the document as if the paper might correct Julian Graves out of loyalty to his name. The gallery lights glowed softly over polished walnut, over half-empty crystal glasses, over the cream folder where Amara Delaney's signature sat clean and final beneath the controlling owner clause. Then his mouth tightened. Around him, the elite did what they always did when power changed hands. They adjusted their silence. A collector in a navy dinner jacket stopped looking at Preston and began studying Amara with the careful attention reserved for someone who could open or close doors without raising her voice. Two women near the sculpture alcove lowered their champagne flutes, their whispering so precise it sounded like silk tearing. A private banker checked his phone, not casually, but with the quick discipline of a man revising tomorrow's calls. Brielle felt it before Preston admitted it. Her fingers slipped from his sleeve, not dramatically, just enough to create a thin strip of air between them. The painting that had looked like a crown moments earlier now hung behind her like evidence, its quiet colors suddenly heavier than the diamonds at her throat. She looked at Preston, waiting for the old certainty to return to his face, but found only calculation, then confusion, then something much smaller. She had borrowed his importance. Now the lender was empty. Preston tried to smile, but the attempt collapsed at one corner of his mouth. "This is absurd," he said, turning toward Julian as if legal language could be intimidated by volume. "My office handles acquisitions twice this size before breakfast." The fountain pen rested beside Amara's hand, black lacquer catching a narrow blade of light, and she did not reach for it again. "Not here," she said. Julian slid a second page forward, the movement quiet against the table, and the small sound carried farther than Preston's voice. The page listed restricted access terms, private collector privileges, guest authorization limits, and the board's right to suspend a client account for conduct damaging to institutional reputation. Preston read one line, then another, and the blood seemed to drain from his confidence before it left his face. He had thought humiliation was something he could purchase for someone else. The receipt had his name on it. Across the room, the crowd rearranged itself with merciless grace. A museum trustee who had laughed at Preston's earlier joke now angled his body toward Amara. A hedge fund widow with emerald earrings gave Brielle one slow glance. Not cruel, not kind, simply finished. Somewhere near the back office, a glass touched marble with a faint, clean click, and the sound seemed to mark the end of Preston's membership in a world he had mistaken for his personal property. Brielle whispered his name, but it came out thin. She looked down at the signed sale papers, then at Amara's folder, then at the staff who had never once treated her like the buyer. The truth arrived in pieces. The dress, the room, the painting, the man beside her, none of it had belonged to her. Even the insult had been borrowed. Preston leaned closer to Amara, lowering his voice as if privacy could still be commanded. "You set this up." Amara's gaze remained steady, cool, untouched by the accusation. She tapped one manicured finger once on the authorization clause. "You signed first." That was enough. Julian closed the folder with the patience of a judge ending a hearing, and the soft thud landed in Preston's chest harder than any public rebuke. He looked around for an ally, but every face had become a mirror he did not want to stand before. Brielle stepped back another inch, her perfume of vanilla and white flowers suddenly too sweet in the beeswax air. Amara rose from the chair, the hem of her burgundy dress moving like a dark flame against the pale floor. Her heels made 3 calm sounds as she passed the table. The silence followed her. Preston watched Amara cross the gallery floor as if distance itself had become another privilege he no longer controlled. The burgundy line of her dress moved through the warm museum light, past the polished walnut table, past the abstract canvas Brielle had chosen, past the collectors who now parted for her with a respect they had never offered him so completely. The air still carried beeswax, white orchids, chilled champagne, and the faint mineral smell of old stone walls washed clean for people who bought beauty through private offices and irrevocable trusts. He followed because there was nowhere else to stand. Near the rear viewing corridor, the noise of the public room softened into a hush so complete that Preston could hear the small clink of ice in a curator's glass behind him. His confidence tried to rebuild itself in fragments. His surname, his bank accounts, his board seats, the men who returned his calls before sunrise. But each fragment broke against the same simple fact resting in Amara's black folder. Her signature had mattered more than his money. Brielle walked 2 steps behind them, no longer attached to Preston's arm, no longer glowing beneath the attention she had mistaken for admiration. A blonde curl slipped against her cheek as she looked toward the collectors, searching for the envy she had expected to receive. Instead, she found polite avoidance, the kind of refined social death that arrived without raised voices, without insults, without even the mercy of direct confrontation. She faded into the composition of the room she had entered as a spectacle. Behind them, whispers moved like expensive smoke. Someone mentioned the parent company. Someone else murmured about restricted client conduct, donor boards, and reputational clauses. A gray-haired art advisor leaned toward a private banker and said Amara's name with the careful tone of a person recalculating an entire hierarchy. The crowd had not forgiven Preston. It had reclassified him. Julian Graves opened a side door to a private storage room where the temperature dropped and the lights grew cooler. Inside, framed works waited in climate-controlled silence, wrapped edges resting on custom racks, every tag coded, every movement recorded, every object protected by systems Preston had never noticed because he had always assumed protection existed for him. A glass wall looked back into the main gallery, turning the room outside into a muted aquarium of wealth. Now he was the one being observed. Preston stopped beside a steel examination table and lowered his voice until it became almost civil. Amara, this is a misunderstanding. She placed the black folder on the table with both hands aligned neatly at the corners. It is recorded. Julian set down a copy of the acquisition log, the collector access suspension, and the board notification already stamped for internal circulation. The paper did not argue. It documented. Preston stared at the stamp, then at Julian, then at Amara, and the old command in his posture collapsed into something closer to pleading disguised as anger. You cannot just cut me out of a market I helped elevate, he said. Amara opened one page and turned it toward him with 2 fingers. You violated Clause 9. The sentence landed cleanly. No performance followed it. Brielle exhaled softly, and the sound betrayed how little she understood the machinery she had tried to decorate herself with. Her eyes moved over the legal language, but none of the words offered her a place to stand. No apartment, no painting, no collector's circle, no whispered congratulations from women she wanted to outrank. Only a purchase tied to a man whose access had just been revoked. In the outer gallery, Crystal touched Crystal as someone resumed a conversation without Preston's name in it. That was the final cruelty. Life continued. Amara lifted the fountain pen, added one short notation beside Julian's prepared line, and returned the cap with a quiet click. Preston watched the motion as if the sound had locked a door inside his own chest. He had entered the gallery to make his wife feel replaceable. Now every system in the building recognized her as final authority. Amara picked up the folder and stepped toward the door. We are done, she said. The words did not echo, but they seemed to remove the air from the storage room. Preston stood beside the steel examination table with his hands half-curled, as if he still expected the world to hand him something he could grip, purchase, or command back into place. Behind the glass wall, the gallery continued in soft motion. Crystal rims touching, silk hems brushing polished stone, low voices discussing museum loans, family offices, and the quiet movement of assets through trusts with names no society page ever printed. He was close enough to see the room he had lost and too far away to belong to it. Amara did not wait for his answer. She walked back into the main gallery with Julian at her side, the black folder held against her body like a closed verdict. Every step she took sounded measured on the pale floor, not loud, not dramatic, but clean enough to make conversations thin and bend around her passage. The people who had watched her insulted now watched her differently. Respect arrived without applause. Preston followed several paces behind, and the distance exposed him more brutally than any accusation could have. His tuxedo still fit perfectly, his watch still caught the light, his name still meant money in rooms built for money, but none of those things restored the ease that had vanished from his face. He tried to nod at a shipping magnate near the sculpture alcove. The man looked through him, then turned toward Julian. That small rejection landed first. Brielle drifted after Preston like someone who had missed the last elevator in a building where she did not have clearance. Her champagne silk dress, so triumphant beneath the gallery lights minutes earlier, now looked too bright, too eager, too unprotected. She touched the necklace at her throat, then lowered her hand when she realized no one was looking at the diamonds anymore. The room had learned she was not an arrival. She was evidence. Near the walnut table, the chosen painting remained under its perfect light, silent and severe. The sales folder rested beside it, signed and approved, while the restricted access notice sat on top, with Julian's neat legal tabs visible along the edge. Preston saw 2 collectors glance at the notice, then at him, then away. Their silence had become a language. He stepped toward Amara and lowered his voice, but the desperation in it traveled farther than he intended. You are making this personal. Amara paused beside the table and looked at the document, not at him. It is procedural. Julian handed her a second sheet. and she reviewed it with the calm precision of someone checking a dinner menu rather than dismantling a public illusion. The paper listed account suspension, guest privilege review, pending board notice, and temporary removal from all private acquisition channels. No insult was written there. That made it worse. Preston's jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again, each expression failing before it could become authority. He turned toward Brielle, perhaps expecting loyalty, perhaps expecting outrage, but she was staring at the floor where her reflection trembled faintly in the polished stone. She understood now that she had not been displayed as a woman chosen above a wife. She had been carried into another woman's institution as proof of a man's blindness. A curator passed with a silver tray, and the soft clink of untouched glasses sounded almost obscene in the quiet. Someone near the entrance whispered that the Langford account was under review. Someone else murmured Amara's name with the kind of caution reserved for people who could close doors across continents. The contempt that had once hovered around her silence had reversed into fear. Preston heard it happen. Amara took the fountain pen from Julian, signed one final acknowledgement, and set it down parallel to the page. The movement was exact. Nothing else was required. The final acknowledgement changed the room more than the revelation had. Before, Preston had still been able to pretend this was a private humiliation inside a public misunderstanding, a temporary embarrassment that his lawyers, his bankers, or one cold phone call could reverse by morning. Now the document lay on the walnut table with Amara's signature beside Julian Gray's prepared notation, and the gallery staff moved around it with the efficient calm of people carrying out policy, not punishment. The smell of beeswax and white orchids remained unchanged. That was the cruelty of power. Preston looked at the signed page, then at the collectors who had once competed for his approval, and for the first time that evening his face showed not anger, but inventory. He was counting what had already left him: access, reputation, certainty, the private rooms where deals began before markets ever heard about them. His watch still cost more than most apartments, but it could not buy back the way the room had looked at him before Amara stood revealed as the final authority. Money remained in his name. Deference did not. Brielle stood near the chosen painting with her fingers folded too tightly around her small evening clutch. A few minutes earlier, she had imagined where the canvas would hang, how visitors would ask about it, how she would say Preston had insisted she deserved something rare. Now she understood that every person in the gallery would remember the painting differently, not as a gift, but as the object that exposed how little power she truly possessed. She had wanted to be envied. The room had already placed her outside the frame. Across the gallery, the social machinery turned with silent precision. A museum patron who had ignored Amara at the entrance now asked Julian whether Madam Chair would be available for a private conservation discussion next week. A collector from Geneva murmured that the Delaney structure had been underestimated. A venture chairman lowered his crystal glass and told his assistant to remove Preston from a dinner list without making it appear abrupt. The whispers were not loud. They were lethal. Preston heard enough. His shoulders squared once, trying to recover the old shape of command, but the motion looked rehearsed, almost borrowed from a version of himself that no longer stood in the room. He stepped closer to Amara, lowering his voice as though intimacy could weaken legal fact. "You let me walk into this." Amara turned one page of the folder, aligned the corners, and looked at the clause instead of his face. "You chose the room." Julian placed a sealed notice beside the sales authorization, its embossed edge catching the gallery light. It confirmed that Preston's collector profile would be placed under reputational review, pending board assessment, with guest privileges suspended until further notice. There was no anger in the language, only consequence. Preston reached for the page, then stopped when Julian's hand rested lightly on the folder. The gesture was small, almost courteous, but it reminded everyone nearby that the paper no longer answered to Preston. Brielle saw it too, and something in her expression emptied. She looked toward the exit, then toward the painting, then toward Preston, measuring which association would damage her least. The man who had brought her here as proof of conquest now looked like a door closing from the wrong side. She stepped back. No one stopped her. The clink of glass returned near the sculpture alcove, followed by the soft continuation of conversations about acquisitions, family foundations, and tax-deductible loans to museums. The evening did not collapse because Preston did. That was what broke him most. Amara lifted the black folder from the table and held it against her side, pearl earrings still beneath the warm light, her expression unchanged by his unraveling. She did not smile. "Proceed with review," she said. Julian Graves inclined his head once, and the order traveled through the gallery without needing to be repeated. A junior legal associate lifted the sealed notice from the walnut table, another staff member closed the acquisition ledger, and somewhere behind the private office door a secure phone vibrated softly against glass before being silenced by a man who knew better than to interrupt a decision already made. The room still smelled of white orchids, beeswax, polished wood, and chilled champagne, but the atmosphere had tightened into something procedural and irreversible. Preston watched the machinery move without him. For years, he had mistaken proximity to powerful systems for ownership of them, mistaking open doors for loyalty, mistaking quiet staff for invisible staff, mistaking Amara's restraint for dependence. Now every efficient gesture in the room proved the opposite. His empire had always depended on people knowing when to move. Tonight, they moved without him. Near the sculpture alcove, the crowd divided itself with subtle cruelty. No one announced that Preston was finished, yet the space around him widened as if his disgrace had become physical. A Swiss collector turned his shoulder away. A foundation director studied Amara with new calculation. A younger investor whispered that the restricted acquisition board controlled more than art, that it touched donor access, museum loans, reputation insurance, and private introductions money could not openly buy. The silence grew expensive. Brielle stood beside the painting and tried to gather herself into beauty again. She adjusted one earring, smoothed the front of her champagne silk dress, and lifted her chin toward a woman she had earlier expected to intimidate. But the woman looked past her as if she were not a rival, not even a scandal, only a guest whose invitation had expired. Brielle's face tightened at the edges. She had wanted to be seen. Now she could not bear being noticed. Preston took a breath that was meant to become a threat, but it came out too slow. "My attorneys will contest this," he said, looking at Julian, then at Amara, then back at the papers because paper had become the only opponent he could still face. Amara touched the corner of the sealed notice with one finger and slid it half an inch toward him. "They may read it." Julian's expression did not change, but the sentence closed every exit Preston had hoped to invent. The clause was clean, the authority layered, the procedural review already triggered by his own conduct during a private institutional event. He had not been trapped by emotion. He had been documented by policy. That realization altered his posture. The proud line of his shoulders loosened, not much, just enough for the men nearby to see what he could not hide. His power had not exploded. It had lost structure. A soft laugh almost came from Brielle, then died before becoming sound. She understood now that Preston's name could still buy cars, apartments, jewelry, vacations, but not the invisible architecture she had truly wanted. Invitations, legitimacy, the subtle nod from people born behind locked doors. The painting would not crown her. It would remain in the record beside her mistake. Across the gallery, crystal touched crystal again, and conversation resumed around them with the merciless grace of the very rich. Someone spoke of a museum wing in Basel. Someone else mentioned a family office transferring a private collection through a Delaware trust. The world Preston had tried to perform for continued without waiting for him to recover. Amara closed the black folder and handed it to Julian. Her wrist moved once, precise and unhurried. The gesture of a woman who did not need to own the room loudly because the room had already acknowledged it. Preston stepped into her path, his voice lower now, stripped of spectacle and sharpened by fear. "You cannot erase me," he said. Amara looked at the sealed notice in Julian's hand. "The record can." Then she walked past him. Amara walked past Preston with the black folder no longer in her hands, and that absence unsettled him more than the documents themselves. Julian Graves carried it now, angled against his charcoal suit like an instrument already filed, witnessed, and sealed beyond appeal. The gallery lights remained gentle over the paintings, over the polished walnut, over the crystal glasses left half full by people who understood that social disasters should never stain the carpet. Preston turned to follow her, but the room had rearranged into a wall of manners. A museum trustee stepped forward to greet Amara, not with warmth, but with recognition sharpened by calculation. A family office director asked Julian whether the board review would affect pending acquisition introductions. A woman with silver hair and a diamond brooch murmured that discretion was the rarest asset left in men who confused wealth with taste. Each whisper removed another brick from Preston's public face. Brielle hovered near the painting, one hand still close to her throat, as if the necklace might anchor her to the evening she had imagined. No one asked her opinion of the canvas now. No one congratulated her. Even the associate who had earlier offered champagne looked past her toward Amara, waiting for instructions that would determine where the painting would be stored, how the transaction would be coded, and whether the buyer's guest would ever be permitted through a private entrance again. Brielle had entered as a prize. Now even her presence had to be accounted for. Preston finally saw her standing alone, and irritation flashed across his face because her fear reflected his own too clearly. He had wanted a witness to his superiority, not a mirror of his collapse. The old instinct rose in him again, the need to blame someone near enough to bruise. But when he looked back at Amara, she was not watching either of them. She was reviewing a tablet Julian had handed her, one finger resting lightly beside a line of scheduled board notifications. Her stillness made blame useless. Outside the glass doors, black cars idled along the curb, their engines low and expensive beneath the rain-dark New York street. Inside, the air held white orchids, waxed floors, and the faint trace of Bordeaux from a glass abandoned near the sculpture alcove. The sound of the city could barely enter, but the sound of exclusion moved perfectly. A name not spoken, a chair not offered, a call not returned. Preston heard all of it before it happened. A younger collector approached him, paused, then redirected toward Julian with a tight smile. That was the cleanest cut. Preston's hand twitched once at his side, searching for a phone, a lawyer, a number powerful enough to reverse the atmosphere. He did not take it out. For the first time, he understood that calling someone would only prove he no longer had the room. Brielle stepped toward him, her voice low and brittle. "Preston, what happens to the painting?" He looked at her as if the question were childish, then realized he did not know. The canvas had become unbearable because it had survived him. Amara turned from the tablet and signed the digital acknowledgement with a short stroke of her finger. "Hold delivery," she said. Julian nodded. "Pending review." The word struck Brielle first. Her lips parted, then closed again around the knowledge that even the gift was no longer safely hers. Preston's expression hardened, but the hardness had no architecture beneath it. It was only a mask held against a storm. Across the gallery, crystal touched marble, a soft, clean sound that seemed to release the room from him. Conversations resumed. Amara moved toward the private exit, and the crowd stepped aside before she asked. The private exit stood beyond a narrow corridor lined with smaller works, each one lit by a single focused lamp and protected behind glass that reflected Preston in fragments. He saw his own face broken across the surfaces, the jaw still lifted, the mouth still arranged for command, the eyes no longer certain where command was supposed to land. Amara moved ahead of him with Julian at her side, her burgundy dress dark against the pale stone, her steps even beneath the low hum of climate control and the distant clink of crystal from the main gallery. With every step she took, Preston's reflection shrank across the glass beside him. Behind them, the gallery resumed its elegant appetite. Collectors leaned toward one another over champagne, discussing museum loans, insurance riders, and whether a foundation in Zurich would absorb a private collection before the tax year closed. The whispers no longer circled the scandal as entertainment. They circled Amara as power newly understood. A man who had once called Preston indispensable now asked Julian's assistant for Madame Chair's office contact. The room had changed its allegiance without spilling a drop. Brielle remained near the chosen painting, stranded between the public room and the corridor, unsure whether following Preston would look loyal or desperate. Her blonde hair, perfect beneath the gallery light, could not soften the vacancy in her expression. She glanced at the canvas, then at the sealed delivery hold notice resting beside the sales file, and understood that even possession had become conditional. The gift was not hers. It was suspended. Preston reached the corridor and finally took out his phone, the black screen lighting his face with a cold blue glow. He scrolled past names that had once represented rescue. Private counsel, investment chairman, a media advisor, a chairman who owed him dinner, a banker who owed him silence. His thumb stopped, but he did not press call. Every name now seemed connected to a room Amara could close before anyone answered. Julian paused by a side console of dark wood and placed a final document beneath a brass reading lamp. The paper smelled faintly of ink and linen stock, the kind used for contracts meant to outlive tempers. It was not a threat, not a speech, not revenge dressed as emotion. It was an institutional notice confirming that Preston's private access, guest privileges, and acquisition channels had been suspended pending review. Amara picked up the pen. Preston's voice came rougher this time, stripped of performance. "You are enjoying this." Amara looked at the line where her signature belonged. No, the nib touched paper with a dry, decisive scratch. That single sound moved through the corridor more sharply than any answer she could have given. Preston stared at her hand, at the steady wrist, at the pearl bracelet barely shifting as she finished the stroke. The last performance of his superiority lost its shape in the corridor's cold light. From the main gallery, a burst of soft laughter rose and vanished without needing his name. The elite had already absorbed his downfall like any other market rumor, over chilled wine and polished floors. Brielle appeared at the corridor entrance, but she stopped when no one turned toward her. Her borrowed importance had expired before she understood the terms. Julian folded the notice and slid it into a cream envelope embossed only with the gallery seal. Amara accepted it, pressed one finger along the flap, and handed it back. "File it." Preston lifted his eyes to hers, searching for anger, grief, anything he could recognize and fight. There was only fact. Amara turned toward the private exit as rain tapped softly against the glass beyond the door. Then the lock released for her. The private exit opened into a narrow, covered passage where the rain made soft silver lines against the glass canopy. Beyond it, black cars waited at the curb with engines running low, their headlights cutting through the wet New York night like instruments waiting for instruction. Amara stepped beneath the canopy first, and the door recognized her clearance with a quiet click that sounded final in a way Preston could not argue with. Behind her, the gallery continued without him. Preston stood at the threshold, caught between the warm light of the room that had rejected him and the cold rain outside where no one was waiting to applaud his recovery. His phone remained in his hand, screen dark now, reflecting a face that still wore wealth but no longer wore certainty. Julian Graves stopped beside Amara, holding the filed notice against his chest, his posture unchanged, his duty complete. Brielle stayed several steps back in the corridor, half lit by the gallery lamps, no longer close enough to look chosen and not far enough away to look innocent. She watched Amara with the stunned stillness of someone realizing the room had never been looking at her. The city hissed beyond the glass. A doorman opened Amara's car before she asked. Preston took one step forward, and for a moment the old arrogance tried to climb back into his voice. "You think this makes you untouchable?" he said. The words came out smaller than he intended, swallowed by rain, engine hum, and the polished silence of everyone who already knew the answer. Amara turned slowly, not as a wife begging to be understood, not as a wounded woman seeking closure, but as the controlling authority he had spent years pretending not to see. Her pearl earrings caught the light from the canopy. Her burgundy dress moved faintly in the damp air. She held no folder now, no pen, no visible weapon, because the damage was already filed, witnessed, and active. Preston waited for rage. Rage would have given him something familiar to dismiss: jealousy, bitterness, emotion. But Amara only looked at him with the calm precision of a signed document. "No, Preston," she said. "It makes you unnecessary." The sentence ended him quietly. Preston's mouth opened, then closed, and nothing powerful came out. Behind him, Brielle lowered her eyes because even she knew there was no elegant way to stand beside a man after that. Julian gave the slightest nod, not to comfort Amara, but to acknowledge completion. The doorman stepped back. Amara entered the car without looking at either of them again. As the door closed, the gallery lights reflected across the black window, briefly turning her face into something distant, sovereign, and unreachable. Preston remained under the canopy, expensive suit darkening at the edges from the rain blowing sideways, watching the car pull away from the curb. Inside the gallery, conversations resumed over crystal, orchids, contracts, and art. Outside, he stood beside the woman he had used as a weapon and the silence of the wife who had taken back the room, the power, and the empire. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.